Number 1.
During the early 1900s, many immigrants left their countries for better opportunities in America. One such immigrant was a 19-year-old man named Benjamin Evangelist. He left Italy and arrived in America in 1904. He then changed his name to Benny Evangelist and worked as a carpenter. Benny Evangelist had gotten married, started a family, and then settled into a home on St. Aubin Street in Detroit, Michigan. He built a comfortable life for his family. 2 years after arriving in America, Benny had an epiphany. He believed God had called him for an unspecified mission. He even wrote his own Bible and called it the oldest history of the world, Discovery by Occult Science. He built an odd contraption consisting of wax figures depicting celestial planets and an electrical eye. The contraption served as an altar. Benny had a fascination with the occult. He chanted and made potions. For people with health ailments, Benny took them down to the basement and performed a healing for anyone willing to pay up to $10. In today's currency, this would be equivalent to around $300. But if it healed you, then it was money well spent. Benny's faith healing also created enemies. Disgruntled customers who went unhealed became angry with the self-appointed prophet. The Evangelist family would become the subject of one of Detroit's most gruesome murders. Benny had bought salvageable lumber from a recently leveled home. On the night before Benny's death, he arranged for a truck driver to pick up the wood on the following day. Benny wouldn't live long enough to meet with the driver. On July 3, 1929, someone broke into the Evangelist home and used an axe to murder Benny, 43, his wives Antina, 36, and 4 children. Angeline, 8, Matilda, 5, Jay, 3, and their 18-month-old son Mario. The killer also decapitated Benny. A neighbor wanting to discuss a business deal with Benny discovered the tragedy the morning after the murder. The police investigated the brutal murders. They believe someone killed the entire family for money since they found none in the home. One of the most troubling aspects is the truck driver who never showed up to meet Benny. One might think he would show up if he knew Benny carried cash. Did the driver somehow know Benny wouldn't arrive? There are many theories about the murders. One theory is that a disgruntled customer killed the family after paying for a healing he didn't receive from the self-appointed prophet. Another popular theory is that a random madman had broken into the house and robbed the family. Perhaps the killer realized the family stored cash collected from healings in the house. Police also thought a rival religious leader may have killed the Evangelist family. The police offered a $1,000 reward for information and interviewed several suspects. A man named Robert Harris was the only suspect given any serious consideration for committing the crime. However, police ruled out Harris as a suspect. No one ever collected the reward. Today, the case remains unsolved. The Evangelist home that once sat on 3587 St. Aubin Street in Detroit no longer exists. It's just a plot of dirt. The Evangelist murders remain one of Detroit's oldest and most gruesome cold cases. On a stranger note, people have reported seeing supernatural activity on the land. Supposedly, a rumor exists about a wandering headless man in the area. There have also been reports of screams coming from unseen people. This could explain why no one is interested in building a home or business over the site. The mystery of the Evangelist family murders will forever remain unsolved. But it hasn't stopped true crime aficionados from trying to figure out what happened on St. Aubin Street on a warm summer evening in July 1929.
Number 2.
Despite taking place over a century ago, the murder of Bella Wright is still theorized over today. Also known as the Green Bicycle Mystery, the biggest debate that surrounds the case is whether or not the guilty party was actually found, placed on trial, yet still got away with murder. On the evening of July 5, 1919, at around 6:45 p.m., 21-year-old factory worker Bella Wright was riding on her bike. Bella was going to visit her uncle, George Measure, in Galby, a small village in the city of Leicester, England. Bella Wright was an attractive young woman who was engaged to a stoker in the Royal Navy named Archie Ward, and also attracted the attention of several other men. She had previously spent time working as a domestic servant after leaving school at 12 years old, but by 1919, she was working the late shift at a rubber factory. She would ride the 5-mile journey on her bike for each shift, and even when not riding to work, she was often seen around the many adjoining picturesque small villages running errands on her bike. En route to her uncle's that particular evening, the front wheel on her bike became loose. She stopped to take a look at it, and as she did so, a kindly stranger came over to the young woman to offer his assistance. The man didn't have any tools on him which could help to tighten the wheel, but he offered to travel beside her until she reached her destination. Bella took the man up on the offer, and the two made the journey to her uncle's home. Upon arriving at her uncle's, the mystery man with the distinctive green bicycle fixed Bella's bike. He did so as Bella went to talk to her uncle and his son-in-law, who also happened to be visiting. George Measure later stated he didn't like the look of the man, who was described as being in his mid to late 30s with dark hair, but he said nothing to Bella. Bella had obviously felt comfortable in the man's company, and according to her uncle, she had called him a perfect stranger. At some time between 8:30 and 9 p.m., she said goodbye to her uncle, and happily set off beside the stranger who had seemingly waited over an hour for her. Joseph Cowell, a local farmer driving cattle, spotted a bicycle at the side of Via Divana, also known as Gartree Road, at about 9:20 p.m. As Cowell got closer to the bike, he noticed a young woman covered in blood on the roadside. He quickly made contact with a nearby police constable, who then contacted a doctor. The three men made their way back to the scene, but it was too late. The young woman was already dead upon their arrival. The doctor was of the belief that the young woman had died as the result of a tragic accident, that she had simply fallen from her bike. The PC, a man named Alfred Hall, wasn't as convinced. By this time it was dark on the roadside, so a thorough examination of the body and the scene was not possible, so the body was moved to a nearby cottage. Although there were no signs of a struggle or violence where the body was found, PC Hall had spotted traces of blood on a nearby gate. In the blood was the imprint of a bird's claw. A further look around saw the discovery of the bird, a blackbird of which type has never been made totally clear, which had seemingly managed to choke itself to death, whilst gorging on the body of Bella Wright. It wasn't until the following morning, when the PC's worries of a more sinister event having occurred were proven to be correct. The next day it was confirmed that the victim was Bella Wright. It was also confirmed her death was no accident, she had been murdered. A search of the crime scene in daylight early the next morning by PC Alfred Hall saw the discovery of a .45 caliber bullet less than 20 feet from where Bella Wright's body was discovered, dug into the ground. An examination of her body, once cleaned up, also located an entry wound for a bullet just under the young woman's left eye. A larger exit wound was found in the back of her skull underneath her hair. As soon as George Measure told police that the last time he had seen Bella she was in the company of a mysterious stranger, he became the obvious prime suspect. Posters were sent out in the hope of identifying the unnamed suspect, but no one was able to come forward and put a name to the suspect. Owners of green bicycles in the region regretted ever buying them, as each came under suspicion from both police and the whispers of locals. However, each was always cleared, at least in the eyes of the police. Despite the best efforts of the local constabulary, and even the help of Scotland Yard, the investigation into the murder of Bella Wright went nowhere fast until, on February 23 the following year, a stroke of luck gave them renewed hope and a name. On that cold February day, a worker named Enoch Whitehouse was guiding a canal boat filled with coal along the bank of the River Soar, ironically to the rubber factory where Bella Wright had been employed. All of a sudden its tow rope became snagged on something in the water. On pulling the item to the surface, it was soon revealed that the item was a green bicycle frame. Enoch Whitehouse immediately recollected the murder of Bella Wright from the previous summer and the hunt for an owner of a green bicycle. He thus contacted the police about his discovery. The rest of the river was searched, and further parts belonging to the same bike were found. A later search in a nearby canal also saw the discovery of an army-issued pistol holder and several cartridges. On investigating the bike frame, it seemed the owner had attempted to scratch off and remove both the brand name of the bike and its serial number. They hadn't done a good enough job. Unbeknown to the owner, the bike builders included a secret identification mark on its bikes. The ID number of 103,648 that was revealed could now be traced back to its owner. The police finally had a name for their suspect. Ronald Light, a former civil engineer, was working as a mathematics teacher in Cheltenham, a job he had taken up fairly recently, when he was arrested on March 4, 1920, just over a week after the discovery of the bike in the River Soar. Asked to explain how his bike came to be in the river, he exclaimed he had no idea, at first denying he had ever owned such a bike before changing his story and stating he had sold the bike. Unfortunately for Ronald Light, a witness had come forward saying he had seen a man dumping the bike in the river. The description of the man was a match for Light. Another witness was Harry Cox. Cox had repaired a distinctive green bicycle the day of Bella Wright's murder. Light was placed in an identity parade and picked out by Cox as the customer he dealt with. Finally, George Measure and his son-in-law both also identified Ronald Light as the man who had accompanied Bella to his home the night she was murdered. Furthermore, two young girls, 12-year-old Valeria Cavan and 14-year-old Muriel Nunney, had reported that earlier on the day of the murder, they had been pestered and frightened by a man on a green bicycle. Just as others had done, they too picked out Ronald Light. Evidence against Ronald Light seemed to be growing thick and fast as next came the news that the pistol holder had been issued to him. Despite the overwhelming amount of circumstantial evidence, Ronald Light still denied everything. The pistol holder wasn't his, the bike wasn't his, he had never been anywhere near Galby, and he certainly didn't commit the murder of Bella Wright. 3 months after his arrest, the trial of Ronald Light for the murder of Bella Wright began on June 8, 1920. Light was to be defended by the famous defense attorney Sir Edward Marshall Hall. As the Attorney General said about proving the case against Ronald Light and his constant lies, Sir Edward Marshall Hall told the Attorney General his attempts were not needed. His client was now admitting he was indeed the owner of the bike and the pistol holder, and he was indeed the man who had journeyed with Bella Wright the night of her death. The two young girls who had claimed Ronald Light had frightened them on the day of Bella Wright's murder were dealt with expertly by Sir Edward Marshall Hall. Muriel and Valeria went from being perceived as two little innocent angels to two troublemakers who only came forward after months of newspaper stories for a bit of mischief. The judge himself even told the jury to ignore the testimonies in their final verdict. The Attorney General's witnesses now dealt with. It was time for Sir Edward Marshall Hall to play his trump card and call the accused himself to the stand. Ronald Light gave the impression of a calm and dignified man who had simply had a moment of madness at the thought of being wrongly accused. Light testified that he had indeed met Bella Wright in the village of Little Stretton that early evening on July 5, 1919, and ridden with Bella after finding her having difficulties with her own bike to her uncle's in Galby. He stated it was the first time he had met the young woman. He denied any encounter at all with any other young girls that day. Light claimed he hadn't planned to ride back with Bella. He had instead gone off while she was in her uncle's home to head back to Leicester. However, his tire got a puncture. By the time he fixed it, he decided to see if the young woman was ready to ride back, claiming she just happened to appear from inside her uncle's at the exact moment he arrived back. In his testimony, Ronald Light next stated that he only rode with the victim for a further 10 minutes. At this point, he was still having problems with his tire, and so the young woman and himself parted ways at a crossroads close to Kings Norton. He then had to walk home with a flat tire, thus he was late home. His mother's maid had previously mentioned him arriving home late. When questioned about the green bicycle, Light said he had read about the murder in the newspaper a couple of days later, and knew immediately he was the man suspected of her murder. Rather than come forward, he was terrified that his version of events wouldn't be believed, and so instead he decided to stay quiet, which he admitted was a stupid mistake on his part. He also claimed his mother was unwell, and not putting stress on her was another reason he didn't come forward. He claimed he never went out on the bike again, and some months later he broke it up and dispatched it in the river, along with the pistol holder, denying he ever had the pistol that went with it, after coming back from the war on a stretcher. Light never faltered from his story during hours of cross-examination from the prosecution. The case for the defense moved on to the firearms experts' evidence. The prosecution stated their belief that Bella Wright was shot from a distance of around 7 feet. Sir Edward Marshall Hall argued this couldn't be the case, and that a shot from that sort of distance would have left a far larger entry wound. He also stated the distance at which the bullet would travel from the exit wound would have also been far greater. Sir Edward Marshall Hall also pointed out that although the bullets found in the river with the holster were the same caliber, this was trivial. The bullets had been made in their millions, so it meant nothing. In fact, he argued the bullet found may not have even been the bullet which killed Bella Wright. A theory he gave himself was that Bella Wright was the victim of a tragic accident, and that a stray bullet shot by someone in a neighboring field had killed her. Finally, Sir Edward Marshall Hall asked what was the motive. What reason did Ronald Light have to murder Bella Wright? Of course, nowadays we know people do murder for no real reason, but back in 1920, they believed a motive was needed, and people didn't just kill for the pleasure of it or other meaningless reasons. From all known evidence, the two were complete strangers. No sexual assault had taken place, nor was there a robbery. The defense attorney had made his case expertly. The jury took 3 hours and 7 minutes to reach a final decision. Ronald Light was declared not guilty, a verdict which was roundly cheered in the courtroom gallery. Experts throughout the 100 years since the murder of Bella Wright still to this day argue over whether Ronald Light got away with murder. Those who claim he did state the evidence was overwhelming, and that social class was what actually determined the outcome of the case. It is also possible Ronald Light was responsible, but that it was all a terrible accident. A note allegedly written by Levi Bowley, a superintendent at Leicester Police Station, states that Ronald Light admitted in his cell he had accidentally shot Bella Wright when his gun inadvertently discharged, whilst he was showing off his service revolver to the victim. The problem with this theory is that the letter in question has never been confirmed as authentic. Others believe that Sir Edward Marshall Hall may have been onto something with his stray bullet theory. Another theory of a similar ilk surrounds the bird found at the scene where Bella's body was discovered. The hypothesis is that the bird didn't choke on Bella's blood, but was actually shot by a hunter. The bullet then passed through the bird and struck a passing-by Bella in a horrific accident. The shooter, realizing Bella was dead, fled the scene in fear of his story not been believed and never came forward. I guess after 100 years we will never know for certain, and the murder of Bella Wright and the green bicycle mystery will remain unsolved.
Number 3.
Late one night in February 1886, a saloon in Masontown in East Austin was the scene of a violent and disturbing incident. The surrounding neighborhood was in an uproar because a drunken, raging man had dragged a girl from the saloon to a nearby house, where he could be heard beating and cursing her while she screamed for help. The entire neighborhood had come out in the streets, and the commotion caught the attention of a nearby police officer. Police Officer John Bracken arrived on the scene, and the saloon keeper, Dick Rogers, and a neighbor, Clabe Hawkins, went with Bracken to stop the man from beating the girl to death. Rogers and Hawkins went into the house and pulled the man away from the girl and into the front yard. As Rogers and Hawkins grappled with the man, Officer Bracken got out the handcuffs. The man would not be subdued. He threw off Rogers and Hawkins and knocked Bracken off his feet. The man turned on them and brandished a knife. As Bracken tried to recover, a shot rang out. Bracken drew his pistol and fired. The shot brought down the raging man. The man's name was Nathan Elgin. There was no explanation for Elgin's rage at the girl, named Julia. Bracken's shot did not kill Elgin instantly, but it did leave him paralyzed and mortally wounded. He died the following day. A subsequent autopsy revealed that Bracken's bullet had lodged in Elgin's spine, which accounted for the paralysis. The doctors had also noticed another detail: Elgin was missing a toe from his right foot. During the course of 1885, a series of 8 murders had occurred in Austin, Texas, all carried out in a similar manner. The victims were attacked in their beds as they slept, they were struck in the head with an axe, and then carried into the yard where they were raped and mutilated. The axe used by the perpetrator was left behind at the scene of the murder. Also left behind were the bare footprints of the perpetrator, who forfeited his boots to enable his stealthy entrances and exits. During the investigations of the crimes, the authorities had carefully noted the footprints, which were often blood-stained, and had made distinct impressions in the soil, as the perpetrator carried the weight of the victim. Apart from general measurements of size and shape, footprints in most instances are not especially distinctive, and they would not have been much use to the authorities had they not possessed some unusual feature. But the footprints left behind at the servant girl murder crime scenes did share a very distinct feature. One of the footprints had only 4 toes. The authorities never shared this fact with the press or the general public during the course of 1885. The press frequently complained about the secrecy surrounding the murder inquests and argued that making all the details of the crimes public would facilitate the capture of the responsible parties more quickly. The authorities disagreed and kept certain details of the cases to themselves, details that they hoped would eventually identify the perpetrator and link him to the crime scenes. After Nathan Elgin's death, the authorities unexpectedly had the direct physical evidence they had been waiting for, a foot that matched the distinctive footprints of the killer. But the foot belonged to a dead man. What were they to do with that information? What could they do with it? To imagine the state of mind of the authorities at that time, one has to understand the heightened state of fear and suspicion that was present in Austin at the beginning of 1886. In the months since the last murders in December 1885, the city's police force had been tripled in size. A curfew had been enacted, and private citizens had organized into patrols to guard the neighborhoods after dark. Strangers were forced to identify themselves or be evicted from the city. Saloons and other raucous downtown establishments, usually open 24 hours a day, were forced to close at midnight. A new era of law and order had begun. Would there have been any advantage in revealing that perhaps the midnight assassin was dead? And what if Elgin was not the mysterious murderer of servant girls? It was in the authorities' best interest to wait and see if the murders continued. Maybe the authorities believed they had gotten lucky they couldn't prosecute convict Elgin, but perhaps the problem had been solved. But in February 1886 it was still too early to be sure. It is important to remember that at the beginning of 1886, the Christmas Eve murders were not the last murders, simply the latest, and the investigations into the murders continued, notably with detectives still shadowing other suspects. While the authorities were not able to make use of the evidence against Elgin, the defense attorneys for James Phillips and Moses Hancock certainly were. Eula Phillips, wife of James Phillips, and Susan Hancock, wife of Moses Hancock, had both been murdered on December 24, 1885, and both husbands were subsequently charged with murdering their wives. In May 1886, during the trial of James Phillips, defense attorneys introduced into evidence floorboards marked with bloody footprints that had been removed from the Phillips house after the murder. They were compared to the footprints of the defendant, who removed his shoes and had his feet inked and printed in an elaborate demonstration in the courtroom. Even though Phillips' footprints were substantially different in size than the bloody footprints on the floorboards, the jury was unconvinced. The motives of jealousy and drunkenness, as argued by the prosecution, convinced the jury, and they found Phillips guilty of second-degree murder. When the case against Moses Hancock was finally brought to trial, the Hancock received some substantial legal help in the form of pro bono representation by John Hancock, no relation, a former U.S. congressman, one of the state's most prominent political figures, and one of Austin's most astute legal practitioners. Also providing assistance for the defense, rather than the prosecution, was Sheriff Malcolm Hornsby, who during his testimony described making a cast of Elgin's foot after his death, the significance of the missing toe, the similarities between Elgin's footprint and the footprints left at the Phillips and Ramey murders, and that fact that there had been no further servant girl murders committed since Elgin's death. Even so, the jury was not completely persuaded, and after 2 days of deliberation, a hung jury was declared, and the case was discharged without a verdict. The verdicts in the Phillips and Hancock trials illustrated the consensus on the servant girl murders and the motives behind them, that the murders had been committed by different persons with conventional motives. Was Nathan Elgin the servant girl annihilator?